All right, I'm not sure if you are starting with this QR code or if you're in the middle of this QR code or if this is the last QR code, but it doesn't matter because the guy you're looking at right now, he is the man. He's the boss. This is the guy that came along at just the right time with just the right abilities on the correct side of the war that is going to end this conflict. He knows how to end this conflict. And he is just, he's the number one guy to come out of this conflict outside of Lincoln. So who you're looking at right now, in which you should be on his slide, this is Ulysses S. Grant, General Ulysses S. Grant, okay? Grant has some great qualities. He's calm. He's quiet. He's confident. He doesn't pop off at the mouth. He's not braggadocious. In fact, some people will criticize him for being almost too humble. But when he does open his mouth, nothing but confident commands and wisdom and knowledge comes out of it. He is such an unbelievable guy. He had what's called 4 o'clock in the morning courage. You could wake him up in the middle of the night at 4 o'clock in the morning and tell him that his army had just been attacked and was about to be in full retreat, and he wouldn't panic. He would simply just calmly give you a command and get dressed and get on his horse and go out there, and he would save the day. He's so cool. Look, you see his uniform? Notice how his uniform, or if this is your first QR code, notice how his uniform is different as far as the way it is presented from a lot of other people that are going to be that you're going to take a look at today. He didn't really care about his appearance. He didn't care about giving off an air of being a general, because fancy uniforms aren't what make a general. Command decisions are what make a general. Good leadership skills is what makes good leaders. And so he would often wear dirty jackets. His boots would be splattered with mud. He very rarely wore a sword. He liked to ride horses a lot, but that's not because he was a general and he wanted to be above everybody. He just genuinely had a knack for horsemanship, and he liked to be around horses. In fact, he liked to be around horses more than he liked to be around people in general. And he found people who were egotistical and braggadocious and loudmouths to be people he didn't want to associate with. So he was just a really, really cool and unique guy. First of all, he does go to West Point. He does fight in the Mexican-American War. But he didn't want to go to West Point. His father got him the appointment to West Point. His father owned a harness shop, which is a shop that made leather goods like saddles and, reins for horses and stuff like that. But in the tanning part of the business of that leather shop, of that harness shop, gave off such a terrible stench that Grant didn't want to work there. And so finally, when he was a teenager, 14, 15 years old, 16 years old, his father sits him down and goes, you don't want to work in a harness shop. I don't exactly see you pursuing an education. Son, what do you want to do with your life? And Grant goes, I don't know. And his father goes, well, if you don't know, I'm going to get you an appointment to West Point because you're helpless and you need to do something. And Grant goes, I really don't want to go to West Point. I really don't want to be a soldier. And his dad goes, well, if you have a better idea, tell me. And Grant doesn't have one. He's a lazy teenager who has no idea what he wants to do. And he ends up becoming president of the United States. So his father said, well, you're going to West Point. So Grant goes, okay, I'll go to West Point. He's not real thrilled about it. When he gets there, he does great. He makes friends with a bunch of leaders. If you haven't met him already, he's roommates with James Longstreet. He fights alongside McClellan. He fights alongside Meade. He fights alongside a couple of officers that'll be Confederates. Excuse me. And he does a fantastic job. And he has a knack for horses. He can break them. He can train them. He can get them to do tricks. He is just really, really good with horses. And he wants to be a cavalry officer in the end. But for some reason, no one will allow him to be appointed to as a cavalry officer. And instead, what he is he becomes a supply officer. And he becomes really, really, really good at supplying troops in war and in battle. In fact, there is a story about how his unit is caught in a battle with a group of Mexican soldiers in the Mexican-American War. And they're running low on ammunition. And Grant jumps on his horse and he runs through a hail of bullets to get to the supply dump. And he grabs the bullets and he runs back through the same hail of bullets and he delivers his ammunition to his own men that are running low. And it's such a heroic act that they just absolutely love him for it. Now, Grant fought with Lee in the Mexican-American War, but they're a little bit far apart in age. Lee is not a little bit. He's quite a bit older than Grant, and although Grant was around, Lee was in a position above him as far as authority that when the two meet in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, Grant says, "Do you remember me? We fought with each other in the Mexican-American War." And Lee goes, "I'm sorry, I fought alongside a lot of people, and I'm kind of old now, and your face looks kind of familiar, but I don't quite recollect exactly any memories." And Grant goes, "Well, I remember you distinctly, General Lee, and it was an honor to fight on your side then, and I can't believe that our careers and lives have taken a turn to the place where we are now, where we're facing off as enemies, and you're surrendering to me, because I did have a tremendous amount of respect to you." So Lee doesn't quite remember Grant, but Grant remembers Lee very much. But remember, Lee was very prominent at the outset of the war. After the Mexican-American War, he gets married actually to a woman who is a daughter of a slaveholder from Kentucky, a slaveholding banker from Kentucky. And Grant's family was anti-slavery. Grant hadn't quite developed his ideas on slavery just yet. And he married Julia because he truly loved her. He was not after inheritance. He was not looking to, get into the slave trade or own slaves or anything like that. He genuinely was in love with his wife, and they were in love with each other. And they had a very blissful marriage that lasted until the day he died. He was never, he never cheated on her. Even when he was away from her for a long period of time, he would resist all advances from women. It was something that people around him noticed, that, he truly honored and loved his marriage and his wife. And he was sent out west to California, which at that time was not the California that we know it today. It was very desolate, not very populated. And he was out there for a long time, and he was separated from his wife and his kids. And he got very melancholy, and he got very lonely, and he began to drink. And he became an alcoholic. And it was a reputation that followed him around for the rest of his life, and got in the way of his army career, to the point where he decided, I don't want to do this anymore. So middle of the 1850s, he resigns his commission in the U.S. Army as a major, comes back home, and he tries everything. I mean, he tries farming. He fails. He tries owning a business. He fails. He tries selling real estate. He fails. He fails so many times that at one point it's Christmas Eve, and he's so broke, he doesn't have any money to buy presents for his kids for Christmas. So he goes to a pawn shop and he sells his most valuable possession, which is a gold watch, and takes the money and goes and buys tiny little gifts for his kids for Christmas. That's how bad things got. The farm, the land, and the home was given to him by his father-in-law. And his father-in-law gave him a slave to help with the farming. And this is where Grant's ideas of slavery begin to change, because Grant believes in character. Grant believes in work ethic, honesty, responsibility, telling the truth. And he's working alongside this human being that is forced to work without pay. And he can't stand it anymore. And what he does, which was very legal at the time in a lot of states, is finally he takes his one slave and he takes him down to the courthouse and he fills out the necessary paperwork and he frees his slave. And he says, "Listen, I can't pay you. Please don't come back and farm with me, because even though I've set you free, I don't want you to come back to the farm and help me, because I can't pay you. I'm freeing you to go and live your own individual life, get a job, make a career, do what you want to do with your life. But this idea of owning another human being makes me sick to my stomach. I can't do it anymore." And that's where he begins to develop his anti-slavery and abolitionist feelings, which is probably the reason, most likely, why he stayed loyal to the Union when the country was torn apart. Finally, he goes crawling back to his dad. He's like, "Listen, I left the military. I've tried all this different types of jobs. I'm broke. I need to feed my kids. I need to pay my bills. And so his dad says, you can come work in the harness shop. And I know how much you hate the harness smell. So you can work in the front of the office and you can just be a clerk. You can answer the customers that come into the shop and help them out and make a sale and do paperwork and blah, blah, blah. And he's comfortable and he's doing that. And it makes an okay living. Then shots are fired at Fort Sumter. And friends start coming up to him and go, you are a valuable asset. You are a West Point graduate. You have experience from the Mexican-American War. You've been out West. You're well respected. You need to go back into the Army and do it all again. And again, he's hesitant. Remember, he didn't even want to go to West Point. But in the end, his closest friend at the time, civilian friend, not William Tecumseh Sherman, but a closer friend named Reynolds, finally says, you need to go and see if you can be a help to the Union cause. And Grant says, okay, I'll go. And so he shows up to the recruiting office. Of course, they know who he is. And immediately they put him in charge of an army in the field and they give him the rank of Major General. And he goes at the beginning, he's a mustering officer. What does that mean? It means that he is in charge of all the new recruits, making sure the paperwork's filled out properly, forming new companies, getting them supplied and getting them outfitted, just like he did during the Mexican-American War. But eventually he's given command of an army in the field, and he goes into, his job is to go into what's called the Western Theater of Operations. And I know this sounds weird that Tennessee, Louisiana, and Mississippi is known as the West, but you got to remember 90% of the population lives basically from the Mississippi to the Atlantic coast. So people who are living in Washington, D.C., they talk about Tennessee and they talk about the West. So in 1861 and 1862, when a bunch of Union officers are going down to defeat after defeat to Robert E. Lee in Virginia, there's this general out west that keeps getting his name in the paper about all these battles that he's winning. And people on the East Coast are like, how come all these generals on the East Coast can't do anything about Lee, but this guy way out west, he's winning all these battles? Why isn't that guy put in charge of the army? And even Lincoln is starting to ask his advisors and his other generals going, why don't I get Grant? Why don't I get Grant? Well, the problem was they told Lincoln he's an alcoholic. People were jealous of Grant. They were jealous of his character. They were jealous of his successes. And so a lot of people tried to keep Grant down. And they would spread rumors about his alcoholism that he had when he was out west and he was missing his wife. He, of course, learned to control that the rest of his life. And he did everything he can to try and stop that reputation. Well, finally, after the Battle of Gettysburg and the debacle that is not the crushing of Lee's army, Lincoln goes, listen, I don't care what you guys say. I don't care if the guy drinks himself silly every night. If he brings victories and he defeats Lee and he ends this war, he's my guy. And so Lincoln goes against the advice of all his advisors. He brings Lincoln in from the West. He sits him down in the White House and he goes, I'm going to give you not only command of the entire Army of the United States, I'm going to give you the overall command of the Army and the Navy. I'm going to promote you to Lieutenant General. No one has been Lieutenant General since George Washington in the Revolution. So this is only the second time in history any man in the U.S. Army has been given this rank. And he goes, I want you to run and finish the war the way you've been doing it out west, because clearly you are the winner. And Grant, just being a subordinate soldier, listening to his commander-in-chief, says, no problem. I'll get the job done. He figured out how to beat Lee. He's like, I got 22 million people living in the North. There are 9 million people living in the South. 4 million of those are slaves. I have 90% of the manufacturing capabilities. The South has almost no manufacturing capabilities. I have a huge modern Navy. The Confederates are trying to build a Navy from scratch. Britain and France, as long as we are winning, will not come in and help the side of the Confederates as long as we show that we are defeating him. So what he does is he just relentlessly pursues Lee through Virginia in 1864 and 1865. And it doesn't matter whether he wins the battle that day or not. If he loses a battle on Monday, he gets up Tuesday and he attacks Lee again. And if he wins on Tuesday, he gets up on Wednesday and he attacks Lee again. and he attacks and he attacks and he attacks. And Lee has understood that Grant has figured it out. Grant's not going to sit around and wait for public opinion to turn. Grant is going to grind Lee down until he has no men and no supplies, because Grant knows he has unlimited amounts of supplies and an unlimited reservoir of men. There are whole units in the North that are mustered at the beginning of 1861 that never hear a shot in battle. They are formed in 1861. They are there in 1865, and they never go to battle because the Union Army has so many men that there's a large portion of their army that never even needs to fight. Whereas on the Confederate side, they have such a smaller population and they have so much fewer supplies that almost everybody is affected and involved with the war. And so in the end, in April 1865, Grant will finally corner Lee at a crossroads called Appomattox Courthouse, and he'll force Lee to surrender that portion of the Confederate Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. And with Lee effectively out of the war and Richmond captured shortly thereafter, the war is essentially over by April 1865. So here is a guy who goes from a lazy teenager who doesn't like the fact that he's going to have a military career, has a drinking problem that he fixes, rises to the greatest prominence of his country, and wins a war that is super important to the history of this country. He puts down the Confederate rebellion. Slavery is dead forever. And he's so popular, they end up electing him president in 1868, and he serves 2 terms. And he's now the face of the $50 bill. Ulysses S. Grant has not been given his due in the history of this country, and he really does need to be viewed as someone greater than what we give him. You can go ahead and move on to the next QR code unless this is your last one.